So it's a little bit chillier today, so take a bit of care, because when that colder weather kind of hits us, it takes a little while. You know, one minute we're wandering around in shirt sleeves, next minute we're kind of shivering slightly. So you have your body will be going through a change, and just account for that. As always, go nice and easy and carefully. So rubbing your hands together and tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder. And your arm. Side. Up your chest. Belly. And then your legs. Sitting back. There should be a little bit of weight in your heels, but mostly it's this dropping back, sort of reclining position. Just letting your attention settle on your breathing, your posture. And also aware of that feeling of settling. There's different ways that we can sort of describe it. You can feel almost like the tension, the tightness in your body is dissolving away. The thoughts are settling, like mud settling in the bottom of a jar of water or something like that, different images. But you'll be beginning to build your own impression of this, your own understanding of this, and that's one of the things I think that is so important about arts like Tai Chi is that it actually offers us a kind of toolkit, if you like. And one of those very useful tools is just that ability to find that space, that quietness, that stillness away from everything else. And it has to be a tool that you're comfortable using. So whatever images I offer up, whatever ideas I offer up, if they're useful to you, make use of them. If they're not, then don't sort of think that you're somehow failing or doing something wrong. It's your own experience that should be important to you. Change your position, and once again, just let yourself settle. And really, this feeling is one that is a regular element within the whole practice, and I'll come back to that in a few moments. But to start off with, just turning your head. One of the things that we find is that this position is the sort of, if you like, the default position for the head. Then we move out of it, and then we come back, and there's a sort of settling in here. So just for a moment, it's almost like a pause. It's just for a split second. And you may even find it to an extent at the end of the movement here and on the other side. But to begin with, just see if you can find that at the end of that returning part of the cycle. so that coming into that quieter space, that more settled feeling, it becomes as natural as sort of that slight pause that we get between in-breath and out-breath. Pause is the wrong term, it doesn't actually stop, but everything seems to slow down very much for a moment. And then your shoulders. Again here, your hands drop down, your elbows drop down, and then into the next cycle. And this is part of the regular rhythm of all of the movements. The sort of generic label that we would apply comes from the Chinese tradition, and they talk about yin yang, rather than those terms having set values. They really should be seen as being complementary opposites. So in this context, up would be yang, yin would be yin. Sorry, yin will be down. I'll get it right in a moment. And so at the end of each cycle, there's this slight feeling of settling. We're not in a hurry, and we just naturally move into the upward movement. And then hands out to the sides. And it's quite useful to emphasize that, because one of the things that I've noticed in myself and in people that I teach is that we tend to rush the drawing in stage. So here, for instance, we could say that here as we go back, the front of the body opens, so is yang, and then it's yin. But what can sometimes happen is we find ourselves taking time here and then kind of rushing back. And so it's useful just to remind yourself that there's an importance to that drawing in movement that we don't always recognize. And then around, and that rhythm, that dialogue, dynamic between yin and yang is a constant feature in all of these movements in one way or another. We say yang, the hands open out, yin, fingers curl in, for instance. And then, so I think this is partly due to living in a culture where there's more of a value placed on doing, on being active, on being sort of outward reaching and so on and so forth, and perhaps less of a value based on those moments of just drawing in. They're seen almost as optional extras at times. Now easing forwards, and again you might just get a feeling of settling into your feet, knees back, and it's like you sort of settle downwards in your hips and then you'll push forwards. And again, you may feel that in the feet. It's a bit more obvious perhaps in the movement going backwards. But what we find here is that it's almost like your body's bouncing forwards and backwards. So if you don't take that moment, I'm going to exaggerate, if you're up here and you don't take the moment to do this, to drop down a little bit, actually you won't get the bounce. So far from being a kind of luxury, when we can afford it, as it were, those moments of settling are actually really important elements in the outward going movement. Yin and yang depend on each other. They're the same. They're two parts of the same thing. And take either away, and you start to get an imbalance. So that's the sort of part of the kind of almost the philosophy, if you like, that underpins these movements. and then just turning a little. Remind you just to do be careful. The back, hips, shoulders are areas that can get a little bit stiff, a little bit tight during the colder spell. So just be very careful. Turn the other way. And then circling. And back the other way. Good. And then pull one knee up, lower down. Then you pull the knee up. Make sure your hip on that side is still sinking down so you're not leaning over. Raise your toes, push out, heel down. Bring your toes down, and then just take a moment to very gently push your foot down. So it's like you're on soft sand and just pushing the foot in to the sand. And again. It's good just to feel that contact with whatever floor, whatever surface you're on. And then on the other side, knee first of all, just lifting and lowering. And then lift, push out. So again, we have that moment. We're not, to all intents and purposes, it doesn't look as though we're doing anything. And yet there is something happening. It's just very quiet and really quite hidden. Even describing it in the way that I've been describing is a little bit inaccurate, really, because I think rather than thinking, oh, well, there's activity and then there's stillness, one of the old writings in Tai Chi has this lovely line in it where it urges us to seek the stillness within the movement. In other words, they're not separate things that are complementary. They are part of the same thing. So stillness and movement actually enhance each other rather than work against each other. And I think that's important because, again, it gives a significance to those quieter moments, those more reflective moments that we begin to appreciate a little bit with arts like Tai Chi. So now drop your hands down and start with this exercise again. So you imagine the pillars there, they will move with you a bit. You go forwards and feel what's happening in your chest and your upper back, and then back. And again, there's just this slight feeling pausing. And it's that point where you pause, where when we come to fisherman cast the net, that's when your arms will begin to swing past your knees. So again, the terminology is difficult to to be accurate with. So pausing is probably the wrong way of thinking of it, but it's the closest I can get at the moment. But that moment when we appear to stop with our weight forwards or indeed backwards is actually the very moment when our arms will swing out. So feel the connection between the movement of your weight, between hips and feet, the opening and closing, expansion and contraction between your upper back and your chest. And try and just see that they're all part of the same movement. And this time, don't turn your hands, but let your arms swing right back. As you settle into your hips, they swing back a little bit. And as you settle into your feet, that's when they swing forwards a little. Fisherman cast the net. And then imagine the ball in front of you. One more time. And then pigeon spreads its wings. And pushing a wave. Then one more. And hands fisted, punch with both fists. And turning your hands out. Now, before we move on to the more vertical movements, let's go back to pigeon spreads its wings, pushing away, punch with both fists in a little sequence. We can find ourselves beginning to rush when we do this. There's sometimes be a kind of almost undetectable sense of anxiety. Are you going to get it wrong? Can you remember what comes next? And that causes us to rush. So first thing to recognise, of course, is that it's not the end of the world if you get out of sequence. It's not actually. But that tendency to do that comes from the adrenaline system. When there's any kind of anxiety, the kind of fight or flight mechanism, which is a very primitive part of our system, can actually start to have an effect. And whilst it can be very useful in some circumstances, actually it's quite limited use. And one of the effects that it will have is to make us speed up. And of course, if you're crossing the road and suddenly you realise there's a car coming along, going fast is quite useful. But in a lot of circumstances where there may be that little bit of anxiety or a little bit of a surprise or something unknown, it's not at all useful. So that moment of pausing actually becomes very useful because it breaks that cycle. Do one more. And then bringing your hands back in, sink into your hips and push up. I came across a figure somewhere that said that the length of the whole adrenaline cycle, from initiation to your body breaking down the hormone and returning you to normal, is just over a minute. It doesn't last very long. But the problem is that often in our lives, that system gets constantly triggered. And so it becomes a sort of habitual way of being. Not always a healthy thing. So trying to leave the adrenaline behind for those times when you really will need it. Hopefully you'll never need it, but you never know. Just remind yourself of that phrase. Try and seek the stillness within the movement. And then your hands come out to your sides. Wild goose. Once more. And then heart in the clouds. That tendency to speed up, that tendency to rush into things, to move on to the next thing as quickly as possible. And it's very apparent in some classes that I run, particularly evening classes where somebody's arrived just from work or something like that. You know, we often live lives where we're expected to get everything done as soon as possible, to multitask. The stress builds up in that, and it's quite difficult to make the transition. One of the commonest sort of problems that people report to me and says that they find the slowing down difficult, and I think that's true for all of us to one extent or another. One more time. So now, dragon plucks the stars from the sky. It's a classic exercise that shows up that tendency to rush into things. So really take your time to feel the movement all the way through one side of your body to your fingers, all the way down, sort of draining away. And then slowly transfer your attention to the opposite side and do the same thing on that. So it looks as though I've stopped. When my arm reaches its full length. Doesn't feel as though I've stopped though, because my attention is moving across from one side of my body to another, like a camera slowly panning across the landscape. I'm trying to make sure that I take the time to completely finish one side and not be in a rush to start the other side. Don't be surprised if you find that quite difficult. One more time. And your hands around in front of you. And the same thing here. Complete one cycle of the movement. Letting your hands come all the way down. Finish here in front of your hips. Before you go on to the next cycle. And back. time, if it's comfortable for you, add the little turn in. One more round. One foot out. A scoop in the sea, looking at the sky. Now change to grasping the tiger's ears. And then switch sides. Remember, be careful with your back, particularly in that movement coming back. And interestingly, the things I've been talking about, the importance of this withdrawing movement, the thing that's going to really help you come upright is your hips sinking down. So again, we see this sort of intimate connection, this interrelationship between opposites, an upward movement depending on a downward movement or connected with a downward movement, and then changing. Good. And come back to sitting. Once again, just sitting quietly for a moment. So we get this quietening, this settling, this stillness through the focusing of our attention. It's not reliant on you having intimate knowledge of the exercises, being able to do them perfectly or whatever. It's simply about being aware of what it is that you're doing. From that point of view, it can be quite useful to make mistakes. Sometimes the mistakes are the things that kind of bring your attention back, if you like. So I said about the seeking the stillness within the movement, but another line of poetry that I always think of when I think of this aspect of Tai Chi comes from a poem by W.H. Davis. I don't remember the name of it, but it starts off with, "What is this world if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare." And I think it's very apt to Tai Chi. It's a poem that I can remember I had master when I was in primary school reading to us, which is a long time ago now. So it's obviously stuck with me, that sort of sentiment. I feel quite strongly that one of the great benefits of Tai Chi is that it actually helps us to take that time to stand and stare, and I think that is immensely valuable to us. And it's also one of the things that actually helps us to get better at the movements. And it's important to realise that this is not some kind of separate thing to the physical exercise. Some Tai Chi movements are quite complex, and actually the thing that helps us navigate those movements is that ability to find that sense of stillness, because without that, everything becomes sort of more and more frantic. So, transferring your weight forwards and backwards, and with the turn. So there's various ways that this can work. At the moment, try and make the turn towards the knee that is above the foot that you're moving your weight into. Sometimes, like when we do Wind Blows the Willows, for instance, we do it the opposite way around. We kind of look away, but this time turning towards the knee. Hands in front of you. So notice how much movement there is already in your hands. And I say this because one of the things that can draw us out of that quieter space is, in a way, putting too much effort into what our arms and our hands have to do. The basic thing that they do is they follow the rest of the body. So you're already nearly doing the movement, hitting the ball in front of the shoulder. And all you're going to need to do, you can try it this time, is just adjust your arm slightly and you'll have the movement. Do one more on each side. and then cow gazes at the moon. Here we see, here we come right through the middle, and this is that, if you like to think of it in this way, kind of the point of stillness, if you like, or the location of the stillness. And in Tai Chi terms, in terms of the movement, that brings the focus of our attention into the center of our body, our hips and our waist. And this is described as being like the hub of a wheel. When a wheel spins, it spins around the hub, which remains still. The hub itself is still. And so, again, we get that combination, the interconnectedness of movement and stillness. And then settle. Just again, rubbing your hands together. And tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder. And your arm. Side. Upper part of your chest. Belly. And your legs. Okay, and then stand. So, let your weight come forwards just a little bit. The hips drop back, and then settle down a little bit more. Bring your hands around in front of you. One of the things that you can begin to do, slightly skew here. Oh, that's better. And again, it relates to this sort of, I suppose, sense of patience in a way, is rather than thinking, well, I need to push up, but actually just let yourself settle, don't force yourself down. And sometimes you can reach a point where you just feel that your legs are beginning to push you up. And that can work at the top of the movement as well, because it's really about the pull of gravity. And how the movement in one direction, so going up, how the movement of the pull of gravity gradually overcomes the momentum of the upward movement. On the way down, it's the opposite way around. The springiness in your body, the resilience in your body overcomes the pull of gravity. So by simply observing the movement and being patient, we actually get the movement correct. Whereas if we think, oh, do I go down now? Do I do this? Do I do that? Then it all becomes a bit, oh, what's going on? I can't quite get it. Just let yourself settle into that rhythm. And change into the wild goose, same rhythm. and then parting the clouds. Good. And then just swing your arms around. Just loosen your shoulders. Shake out. Now 1 foot forwards. So when we do this, if you remember when we did the step in the chair, I talked about just gently pushing your foot into the floor. When you go forward, so you start in your back leg, and before you actually move your weight, just to like push gently. It's like you're feeling the floor. Push is, again, an awkward word for this, I think. Same thing when you go back. Just establishing the step. And then when you arrive there, give yourself a moment to settle in. So that kind of moment of pausing, as I've been describing it, is actually the point where two things can happen. One is you settle more fully into the supporting leg, and the other is that you're more certain about where you're going to move the weight to next, about the empty leg. Again, at the moment, I'm in a way separating them out. But if you practice like this, then actually what will happen is it won't be separate anymore. It will just be a natural part of the way that you move. And then you can begin to just raise your toes and your heel. So at times I've gone into quite a lot of detail about how we move the foot, how we take the step, and so on and so forth. But in a way, you could argue that the most important part, or the most important thing that we want to bring in to our mobility is that sense of stillness, because it's there that we establish certain things that are so easily lost. And then just bring your foot in. And shake out. Then on the other side. And then raising toes and your heel. And when you're ready, just stepping in. Shake out. Right. Okay, fisherman casting out. As you settle into the front foot, the hands swing out a little. As you settle into your back foot, the hands swing back. Shake out. And bring it back. Go back to your chest. So Tai Chi is very much seen as a style of exercise, but I think it's just as important to recognise that it's an art of what we might call contemplation. And I think this is one of the great things about it. It has many different aspects to it. I think that contemplative, that quieter quality and so on and so forth is at least as important as the actual movement itself and the physical effects of the practice. So when we practice, I think one of the things that we're doing is just reminding ourselves that that's possible. It's almost like we forget. Again, we live in a very busy world. And I'm just old enough to remember Sundays as being quite dull and boring. You could always tell when it was Sunday because not much happened. But actually, I suppose to a child it's dull and boring. But actually, there was always a point in the week where not much happened, where it wasn't as active, and so on and so forth. So it's a quality that I think we've all lost in our culture. So in our regular practice, it isn't just about doing this exercise and doing that exercise. It's about cultivating that sense of space, cultivating that quality. And it's quite difficult, but it isn't necessarily complicated. It shouldn't be complicated. So some years ago, I used to teach for an organisation that supports people who've had head injuries. And I remember having a chat with somebody there once. We'd been to a few of my sessions, and one of the symptoms of his head injury was that he would get panic attacks very easily. And he said he was in the centre of town by the bus stations, centre of Cambridge, Christchurch, on a busy Saturday, and he could feel this kind of anxiety. Well, anxiety is the wrong word. I think panic attack is different, but he could feel this coming on. He could feel that it was happening, and he wasn't sure what to do. And then he said he suddenly remembered being in the Tai Chi, and what he did was he went into the little park behind the station, found a bench to sit on, and just sat nicely and did some slow breathing, and he said the attack just melted away. It didn't actually come. So it's not, it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be very, very simple, but very, very effective. And obviously that's quite an extreme example, but I mean, it's something that perhaps we can all relate to. So in this last exercise, feel for yourself what the pathway is. I mean, for him, it was the memory of the class and certain things. But I think we all find slightly different things, and we all interpret it and understand it and imagine it in different ways. So embrace tiger, return to the mountain gives us a chance to really focus on how that works for us and what it is you would want to remember. When you're in a busy shopping place, or there's too much going on, too much coming from the TV or whatever. So embrace tiger, return to mountain. One more round. And rest. Lovely. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Are there any questions before we go?
No, I don't think so.